It should be taught to everybody. It should be taught to anyone in any field. I don't care if you're going into business, into law, into medicine, into health, airplane mechanic, hairdresser. I don't care what the hell you're going to do. You need to understand this because these are going to be your clients. These are going to be your bosses. These are going to be people who can make your professional life a living hell. We should be teaching people how to get into healthy relationships because right now we're in the age of sort of the narcissist bro. Like, I want to be like him because he's a baller and he's got a yacht, he's got a Lambo. I don't care if he's a dick, like he gets the girls. If that's a trope and that's a viable mentality, and these people are being rewarded with billions of dollars and tons of societal power. I always say to people, listen, somebody has $1 billion, that's their billion. Let them go with God. Just don't marry them. You know, that like if somebody is really successful at what they do, but they're cruel, admire from a distance, but don't get close to them. You might even want to think twice about working with them. And so it's that sense of, it's almost like I don't want to be Napoleon's friend, even if I could go back in time. I'm guessing Napoleon wasn't a good guy. But so we read about him in the books, but it doesn't mean we have to be with them or be like them.
Dr. Ramani, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being a guest today.
Thank you, Chase. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, we have just had a lovely little conversation prior to hitting record. As our listeners might imagine, we can't just, we don't just immediately start recording. But what I realize is that we've got a lot of ground to cover. And I feel like the best place to start off our conversation for those who might not be familiar with you and or your work is for you to orient us. Is there a way that you can just take us back in time a little bit to your area of focus and interest and why you're on the show today?
Yeah. So I actually bring a pretty varied background. I've worn a lot of professional hats in my life. I was a tenured professor of psychology funded by NIH to do research and, taught hundreds, probably thousands of students. So that was over 22 years. I did that. I'm also a licensed clinical psychologist, and I've been in practice, been licensed to practice since 1998. I'm definitely dating myself at this point. And I've done stuff around governance and leadership in the field of psychology and sort of, how we think about issues on a macro level. I also, though, been sort of a media talking head in some way, shape, or form since about 2008. Part of that was because a lot of people are never going to end up in a therapist room, but they are going to watch whatever, at the time it was called TV. Now they're going to watch whatever the hell they watch, right? But for me, what happened was earlier than that, in the early part of my academic career, early 2000s, I had gotten interested in the concept of personality disorders, and increasingly was what we'd call antagonistic personality disorders, of which narcissism is sort of front and center. And there were two sort of separate threads for me. One was in the research setting. Sort of what we were seeing was that there was medical patients who were going to clinics. Narcissistic clients were actually probably causing the most havoc for the practitioners. They were demanding, they were entitled, they were angry, they didn't show up on time, they were criticizing the frontline staff, they were criticizing the physicians, allied health professionals. I thought, not only are these people maybe not getting the best health care they can, they're burning the personnel out, which is likely causing all kinds of harms for everybody else in the system too. And that started a program of research for me. But at the same time, I was working with patients, and I was seeing how over and over again, they were sharing very similar relational stories, families, marriages. And at the end of the day, they were really describing narcissism in their partners. And I thought we could probably cut to the chase here. No, I wouldn't. It's not like the day one of therapy. I'd say, oh, and your husband's a narcissist. But I would see these patterns and educate them about them, why they're not okay, why it's not just how they are. But what really hit me hard then, after I started going down this rabbit hole, was there was absolutely no conversation. No one was saying anything about the harms that were happening to people in narcissistic relationships. I found maybe a couple of scholarly articles, few theoretical articles, but this should, I'm like, this is like a 5 alarm fire. Why isn't anyone paying attention to this? They weren't, they still aren't. It still remains a controversial area. But what I saw was that the sheer amount of human potential we were losing to these toxic relationships and not having a way to talk about them. I'm often branded sort of a not very nice person. How could you say that? The narcissistic people are going through stuff too, and that's not fair, and blah blah. And I'm like, you know what? I fine, bring it, and we'll have a conversation about it. But that's how I got into this, and it was ironic because people say, "Was it your own personal experience?" Because I've had a lot. It's actually not what drove it. I was doing it. I talk about denial, research, clinical practice, but then I started connecting the dots. I'm in my own therapy. And, then the uncomfortable truth sort of hit me like a ton of bricks. And as I did the massive excavation and went all the way back and saw it in family members, in intimate partners, in friendships, in workplaces, and these were significant relationships that have changed the course of my life. And when that final puzzle piece got brought in, and as psychologists, Chase, we are so indoctrinated. It's unfortunate, personally, I think, to be almost robotic as practitioners, as though we don't have a life, we don't have an us, we don't. It's like, it's that sort of analytic blank slate. I don't like that. I find it elitist. I find it distancing. I find it cold, and I'm definitely much more of a humanist. But I thought the more I can sort of be aware that this happened to me and bring that genuine presence to this work, then that was going to be the game changer. That was the game changer. And so then, and as everyone should know, you should always work with people who are older than you and people who are younger than you. In fact, the worst thing you can do is work horizontal. Older, younger. The people, especially for a woman, I look at the giants whose shoulders I've stood on in terms of being able to sort of continue in academic research and just learn wisdom around clinical practice. But the younger folks, in my case, new tech, and it was graduate students who ultimately former students approached me and said, "Hey, you know what? Your books are really cool, but no one our age reads, but we do watch YouTube." I'm like, "Don't be ridiculous. YouTube is for gamers." And they're like, "No, actually it's not." And they said, would you give us a chance? Would you give us 6 months to work with a YouTube channel with you? Because we think we can make something of it. And I thought like I was being like a nice mommy figure. I'm like, "Sure, sweet girls, we'll do that." And we're 1.6 million subscribers. So we started with nothing.
Well, there is a lot there. And specifically, I want to start on narcissism. That is the core of your work. That's how I originally discovered you. Your last book called Don't You Know Who I Am? How to Stay Sane in an Era of Narcissism, Entitlement, and Incivility. So let's just start at my original connection with you and your work. And in part because what captured my attention in that moment was, wow, I'm aware that this universe of social media, new emerging, you just cited YouTube, for example. But I would throw, all of the Instagrams and Facebooks and Twitter, X, all this under the umbrella, that in some way I feel like these are contributors to a lot of the this era of narcissism, entitlement, and incivility. And yeah, I think some science has come out since I started feeling this, but I'm wondering if you can start off by saying, helping us understand the role that plays in a lot of these conditions, and how to increase our awareness.
So the best way to think about it, because I think what happens is this simplistic read on all that work is it's social media, all this stuff. It's not what we call an ideological contributor. It's not contributing to the origin of narcissism. No one is becoming narcissistic because of Instagram, right? It is what it's done is it's created the fertile ground. It's created the petri dish. So it is allowed to flourish there. It's given them a mothership. It's given them the arena, as it were. So I'm old enough to have known a world, a full grown ass adult world where there were not these things, right? Where I still type, at the beginning of graduate school, I still used a typewriter to type papers, still had to write code for statistical analysis programs. So I come from that era. So these things didn't impact me developmentally, but they are impacting people developmentally now. However, at the end of the day, narcissism, like any personality style, I wouldn't even say it's a condition. I'd say it's a personality style. You've got a personality. I got a personality. Narcissistic person has a narcissistic
Sure.
personality. It's a maladaptive personality because it puts them at odds with other people because it doesn't account for other people, but it's also associated with success, which we'll get to in a minute.
Mm.
But what happened is the narcissistic people have always been there. They were there long before
Yes.
there was internet. They were there long before there was Instagram or selfies. I don't know if you've ever tried to take a picture of yourself with a film camera, but I do remember those days, like being in the Eiffel Tower when I was like in high school or something. I'm like, you're doing the can either you got your eyes or you got your chin or you got your ear. We didn't have pictures with ourselves in them unless somebody took the picture. So the whole selfie Instagram of it all, right? That took something that already existed. A person becomes narcissistic through a complex combination of temperament, of attachment, of parenting, of early life exposure, of early life environment, and all that goes into a blender, and that creates our personality. And the identical conditions for two people can still create two very different
Yeah.
personalities. So it's not a personality science is not a perfect ideological science. But then you create this thing called social media. And I had a very, very interesting conversation, which I keep bringing up with a guy named Dr. Keith Campbell, who's a brilliant researcher at the University of Georgia. And he's been studying narcissism for as long as I have, but he's done it more as a personality and social psychology researcher, where I've done it more as a clinician, as a person who practices. And we both kind of agreed with this. Narcissism's always been there. This is not new. These people who held court and behaved like jerks and had no empathy, they've always been around. They just got their audiences and their validation in different ways. Where the internet has gotten real interesting, grandiose narcissism, arrogant, pretentious, always a thing. But these vulnerable narcissistic folks, aggrieved, resentful, sullen, angry, moderately paranoid, no empathy, lots of grudging entitlement, failure to launch, that form of narcissism has gone off in the era of social media. These are your internet trolls. These are your angry people online. These are the people who just sort of go down the rabbit holes and why isn't it my turn? And how come nothing's working out for me? That group didn't have anywhere to go. I think they probably were just sort of loners or never got into intimate relationships or anything like that. This is a different group now. They have gotten pumped up in a way, and it's dangerous. This is a dangerous group because they are so aggrieved. And so it is not that social media makes it, it fosters it. And here's the thing, not everyone who takes a selfie is narcissistic. It is a means of communication. I've got kids who are in late adolescence, early adulthood, and I watch them. When they were babies, it didn't exist. But I watch them use it, and it's not as dysfunctional as I would think. It's very seamless. They're communicating with people. They're engaging with their lives. There's follow-up conversations. They're using a language I don't use because I didn't come up speaking it. So it is, I mean, my kids aren't always taking selfies. They're on it a lot, but then they'll turn to, and I'll say, what are you watching? And they'll turn to me. They'll show me a video about how someone made salsa. And they're like, isn't it interesting how they made that salsa? And I'm like, I really can't be mad at this because they're actually just, you know what I'm saying? It's not that I mean, there's some things that are dysfunctional and they'll do body image stuff and all of that.
Sure.
However, we also know about the research, Chase, is that there's a subset of folks who are more vulnerable to the nefarious impacts of social media. And that group, we can't generalize that to all people, but that group is very high risk. So it's a very complicated landscape. Has it created a wonderful mothership for the narcissist? Yes. Does it cause it? No.
Got it. So let's just go into narcissism specifically then, since it's existed since for all of humanity.
All of humanity.
What are the telltale signs?
So narcissism as a personality style is characterized by somebody who has variable empathy, entitlement, grandiosity, a need for admiration and validation. They are envious of other people. They think other people are envious of them. They're arrogant. They're selfish, superficial, vain. They think everyone wants to be like them, or they covet being like other people. very materialistic, very controlling. They're very motivated by power and domination. Now, all of that's happening. That's
Sure.
like this big sphere of narcissism. What's at the core of this sphere? Insecurity, shame, vulnerability. And they want to view themselves as perfect. So all that regular people stuff, that's not going to work for them. So this stuff like the grandiosity and the arrogance and the entitlement, that's their suit of armor. And this idea of interpersonal vulnerability, oh, heck no, that's not happening for them. So they really come and muscle up in relationships. And so that's narcissism. And obviously, there's a million more subtleties than that.
Sure.
It's on a continuum. It's not an either or. It's not you're a narcissist or you're not. At the mildest ends on the spectrum of narcissism, you're talking about someone who's sort of, again, more of this Instagram selfie, look at me, isn't my breakfast interesting? Aren't I pretty? Don't I have a cool car? Emotionally sort of stunted and immature. They're probably not harmful, certainly not someone that you're going to have a very fulfilling long-term committed relationship with, not someone who's probably going to be a very healthy parent, but they're not harmful people, right? They're sort of ridiculous in some ways. When you get to the highest end of the severity spectrum, now you're talking about more of a malignant narcissism, and you're almost like veering into territory that's like psychopathy. It's not psychopathy is its own thing, separate, but in malignant narcissism, you see exploitation, coerciveness, deep levels of manipulation, isolation, cruelty. That's very different than someone
Yeah.
who's posting pictures of their breakfast in a bikini.
Got it. Helpful. Now, this show, a lot of things on the internet, has a bias towards individuals who have achieved some sort of success. This is one of the longest running internet podcast shows, hosting guests. You yourself are a guest on television, for example.
Mhm.
So how do we sort of understand the line? Because you're describing, at one end of the spectrum, someone who is largely a high achiever and is, as we are social animals, right? We do need to, in some ways, fit into the tribe. And I've always said you can't fit in and stand out at the same time. So there seems to be some paradox here. I'm wondering if you can help us understand, maybe thin slice this a little bit. Does it mean
Mhm.
because you're on TV that you're a narcissist? Does it mean that because this show, for example, wants to highlight high performers, and high performers are probably from some trauma bonds they experienced in childhood, really doing everything they can to get attention? Where is the line? And is there some sort of, if that's a spectrum, is there another spectrum, which is the
Mhm.
health spectrum of peak performance, for example, or being an expert?
So you sort of asked two questions. The one is sort of the thin slicing, almost looking at this evolutionarily as a species mandate. We're a social species. We exist in social groups. Human beings are not lone wolf hunters. We've always lived in tribal systems of somewhere between 100 and 150 people. It's how we share information. It's how we've always been. It's just in fact why I think we're struggling as a species right now. We're not living in that way. But we are hominid species, which is just one step away from a primate species. And primates are hierarchical. There are alphas. There are then people under that alpha. The alpha is a male designated, biologically male designated member of that particular tribe, right? Troop, call it what you will. Same thing with human beings. There is an alpha structuring to human beings. Open a history book, right? They don't talk about the sweet baker or the kind miller or the angel of a blacksmith or the sweetie pie of a seamstress. They talk about the people who invaded and raped and pillaged and destroyed, and in some cases innovated. But that's who we read about. I would guess 80% of the people in our history books are narcissistic,
Mm,
right? So they definitely are the people who make history. When unfortunately, because of that, so much of human history is the stories and the narrative of narcissistic folks, not of the ordinary bread baker or seamstress,
yes.
right? And it still is the case. Our leaders are mostly narcissistic. Our CEOs are narcissistic. Our celebrities are narcissistic. Most you flip through anything, most of the content by high, big, fancy, famous people, they're narcissistic. Okay. Because in order to be playing at that level of playing field, there is a drive and a determination and a willingness to knock the other people out of the way to get there, because not everyone fits at the top of that pedestal.
Mm.
So so this idea of how does this work evolutionarily? It works just fine evolutionarily for them, because they're creating lots of little genetic copies of themselves. They're ensuring their place in the reproductive hierarchy. They're fine. They're doing fine.
Got it.
So, and there's a lot more thin slicing I can do, which will go probably deeper than you'd want to. But going to the other piece then, if a person wants to be on TV, and it's funny you bring up that example, because I get this all the internet's a very mean place. Dr. Ramani, you're a narcissistic B word because you really just want to be on TV. I'm going to tell you something very interesting, because you hinted at this, and I'm going to be very open and vulnerable
Great.
here. I had to go back, and I had, looked back to why. Why did I want to be on TV? Because I can talk this big game about psychology and the public interest, and I want people to learn. But I had to, in my own therapy, dig deeper. Why? Because I'm a very introverted person. I don't like being with other people. I don't like parties. I don't like gatherings. I'll always choose to be alone. And so why would I want this? And I'll tell you, I go back to childhood. I'm a child of immigrant parents. And when we were lower middle class, my family struggled in their fashion financially. And when the groups of family, extended family would get together, they'd watch the TV. But it's like these were immigrant families that were struggling. They certainly were not paying attention to their kids. It was very patriarchal. I was a girl. There was negative 0% interest in me, my interest. And I thought, damn it, if I was on that TV that they're watching so intently, can you imagine? I'd be loved. So when my 45-year-old ass decided to show up on TV, I was a 5-year-old girl who was looking to be seen.
Mm.
And ironically, I guess I was decent enough at it that I kept booking jobs. And then it became this higher order thing where I was actually getting meaningful education out there to people that would help them. But let's just go raw on it. I was the kid who was not seen.
Mm-hmm.
And somewhere in my little head in the 1970s, with the idea, if you were the person on the TV, then the whole room would be focused on you and you wouldn't be ignored in the corner.
Mm.
That's it. And so that is a wounded part of me. If tomorrow someone said you could do what you do anonymously and get paid the same amount of money, I'd be like, sign me up. You ain't never going to see my face again. Bye. And so the need goes no further. If I could do this anonymously or not do it at all and get paid the same, I would be fine with it. Like, I actually don't like being a public figure. It makes me uncomfortable. It's actually put me in harm's way at times. So I don't like it. But it gets to this bigger question then of, if a person wants to be a public person, are they narcissistic? Not necessarily. It really means we have to do the deeper dive on what does this mean? What do we hope for? But we also have to look at all that other stuff around narcissism. Are you empathic? Like, can a person be a public figure and still be attuned to the people around them, be compassionate to the people around them, recognize that they're no more special than anybody else, that they're not arrogant and they're not dismissive? If you're not those things, you're not narcissistic. You're just a person on TV. The fact is, though, to get to the highest levels, to be the person who is the person on TV, yeah, you probably had to do some rotten things to get there. It's just like, I don't think there's any such thing as an honest billionaire either. It's the same thing. You have to do some shady stuff to get there. So now let's pivot to what you brought up about peak performance. This gets into an interesting two-pronged conversation based a lot on clinical work I've done. There are some people out there who strive for peak performance for the sake of peak performance, to talk about peak performance, to view themselves as some sort of optimal human specimen who has learned the way to optimize their nervous system and their body. Does that smell like narcissism? You better believe it. Are there people out there who think of peak performance as work that is, like, I think of the work on flow, right? As people who have found something that is so compelling to them as a creative pursuit, as whatever it is, that they're like, the time just went away. I love it. And again, as a scientist and a scholar, I have worked with many a person who will be in the back corner of a lab all weekend, running the statistics, looking at the specimens. There's no one's paying attention to them. The time just goes. It's not peak performance, and they're just really good at what they do, and they derive tremendous meaning and purpose from it. That's peak performance, but that's the not narcissistic form of peak performance. Do you understand
Yes.
where I'm going with those two directions? There's the fetishized peak performance, and then there's the authentic peak performance.
Got it. So this to me begs the question, isn't it strange that our culture can desire to celebrate excellence, and by way of the media, by way of the vehicles that exist today that used to not, by way of who we decide to celebrate, that we are in fact somehow eating our own tail. We're pointing at examples.
Correct.
We're pointing at examples
Yep.
of as you know, to simplify this argument a little bit, you're looking at television saying, I want to be on television. As you mentioned, there are the 5-year-old girl, the childhood wounds, and yet, and then here we are, all of us participating in some degree or another, some willingly and knowingly, some accidentally. And this is why I'm trying to sort of excavate this so that we can bring it into our awareness. Is it possible for us to break this cycle? Can you celebrate peak performance? Can you help your children look at people on TV as examples? Because otherwise it's more difficult in an isolated world to find examples for our children, say, of greatness. There's no one who is, or there may be fewer examples of people directly in contact with our kids and our families who are shining examples of what's possible with this one precious life. And so can we then point at all beyond this to the television, to the media for peak performance? Or are we just going to give our children, or I'm using children here as an example, but do we have lower bars? Do we have less vivid examples of what's possible with this one precious life because we're worried about exposing them to this cycle of narcissism? How do we break the cycle? How do we help them see greatness when greatness might not be near them? I have a philosophy that you can't be what you can't see. So
That's fair. Yeah, I see where you're getting with that. So here's the thing. Media sadly exists to sell stuff.
mhm,
Right? If you think back to the 1950s model of television, it's we're going to put on a little story so we can sell refrigerators.
Yes.
But it's always about the refrigerators.
sure.
It was never about the story. Okay. So it is in radio was similar. So media is a platform that still somebody is underwriting this and they're going to get theirs.
Mhm.
Okay. And so as a result, that which is going to show up the most prominently and the most loudly and the most vociferously in media is that which is going to get the most eyes and subsequently the most money. And we are at a time where shameless, outlandish, cruel, attention-seeking, ridiculous behavior is what's attracting eyes. It's a fact.
For sure.
Okay.
Negativity,
So,
bias, all sorts of human things.
all that
underpin
stuff.
Yep.
Cruelty, negativity, polarization, mockery, inappropriateness, whatever it may be. None of this is role models for anybody. I don't care if they're kids or not, but that's what gets eyes. And so then you have this bigger issue of how do you put the eyes on to greatness? Well, then the society has to agree on what greatness is. Because by and large, narcissism is correlated with success when we're talking about grandiose narcissism. Narcissistic people make more money. They're overrepresented in leadership. They're more likely to secure a romantic partner. So many of the key metrics in our society link to narcissism. Now, they're not marathoners, they're sprinters, but they're noisy sprinters. And they can get a lot of eyes on them. And the fact is, Chase, most people don't want attention. They're willing to be quietly great. They're a great second grade teacher. They're a great mechanic. They're a great volunteer at a food bank. These are great people, and they're not in our, sort of in our public purview.
Yeah.
Part of it is like finding the diamonds in the sand kind of thing, because what's being put out in public often isn't that. But what it does mean is, as long as we're giving so much airtime and we're excusing so much bad behavior all the time, because the fact is, I don't care if you're a left-leaning, right-leaning, or centrist media organization, the noisier, crazier a politician is, the more people are watching them. So this is no longer about the point of view of the media outlet. They're like, bring on a crazy politician because we're gonna have people watching us. That's my point, is that they're still selling something. And so if a reasoned, empathic, compassionate, accountable, responsible, wise, thoughtful politician came around, they'd last 24 hours, if that, because it doesn't work. And that's where I'm saying is that I do think they're great people. When I say great, I mean in this not narcissistic, not antagonistic, good, present, attuned, empathic, kind, respectful, solid people out there they're great and they're doing great things. The way the world is organized now, it's all but impossible to get eyes on them. I'm telling you now, I'm someone
Yeah.
who's trying to book gigs for books, and I get a lot of like, yeah, you're not big enough. You're not big enough. And I'm thinking to myself, if I launched a sex tape, which would actually be the greatest tragedy of our time and probably a snooze fest, but if I did something outlandish, all of a sudden you're telling me I'd book one of these gigs for my book? That disgusts me.
Yeah.
And so you have to find the grassroots way to get out a message that's important. But as somebody who's been told way more times than yes, because I'm not big enough, I don't know what the answer is.
Give us a path out of this, because this paints a very worrisome picture for
Yeah, it's a worrisome picture.
and
Yeah.
and I'm not afraid of worry, because the goal of worry is to create
Mm-hmm.
action, right?
Mhm.
And if I've learned anything, that action starts with a handful of committed people. What's the saying? In fact, that's the only thing that has ever changed
Mhm.
history. So let's just say you have our attention, right? And I'm now referencing, for example, your most recent book that you mentioned, because you don't have a sex tape, but we need to get this out there.
I never will, thank you.
It's not you.
Yep.
Identifying and healing from narcissistic
Mhm.
people. So as a culture,
Mhm.
again, acknowledging that there's this is a spectrum, but by and large, we have to take action. And when we give unwillingly or unknowingly our attention to, I'll use your political example and any n number of other examples out there on the internet, we are actually fueling the exact
Yeah.
thing that we
Yeah.
do not want in our culture. So
Mhm.
please, doctor, what's the
Mhm.
path forward?
We have got to talk openly and honestly about what this is. So here's where it gets interesting, Chase, especially given what you talk about on this podcast. How do we separate the innovator from the innovation? Right? Because we're in the cult of personality right now.
Mhm.
I've got all these kinds of tech doodads on my desk and on my computer, and I use them. And I'm grateful for them because they make my life easier. Have they ruined some people's life? Sure, but they make my life easier. And behind many of these innovations was a really rotten person in some cases, right? We do not need to lionize and lift up and celebrate and worship these people who've made these innovations. We can simply say this thing that was created, whether it be car or device or platform or whatever, was remarkable. And there was innovative thought involved in that, but we don't have to hold that person up as a paragon of goodness. And that's what we keep doing. It's almost like we need to say, if you made this great thing, you got to be a great person. No, not necessarily. They had a great mind for one thing and they did it well. But in the cult of personality we're in, we're trying to create, again, it's this whole persona narrative we're trying to create around things. And that's what's muddying the water. So I think number one is separate the innovation from the innovator. Thomas Alva Edison was apparently a real a-hole. If you read historical accounts, but like, thanks, Thomas, for the light bulb, but glad I wasn't married to you. And that's all I got. Right. And so I think that it's the understanding that there is that difference there. Number two is to know what this thing is. We should be teaching this. I was just talking with someone recently about this idea of like when I tried to say, listen, we should have a high school curriculum on narcissism and antagonism. And I was pushed back with over and over again. That's very negative. And we think that's kind of mean. And as long as we take that stance developmentally, kids need to be learning about sort of what is not okay in a behavioral repertoire. A lot of domestic abuse starts in adolescence. All domestic abusers are narcissistic. Okay, it's not some, it's all. And so being able to identify what's not acceptable, but in the 1970s, we got the whole idea of government needs to stay out of people's lives. Like it was a great way for the government to save money. But what it did was it took away, like if a kid has narcissistic parents, where the hell are they supposed to learn about this? School would have been a great place, but the school won't teach them, thinking we're ruining the family. So there's that piece of, and they should be taught in schools, however we can developmentally appropriately teach it. It should be taught to therapists. It should be taught to everybody. It should be taught to anyone in any field. I don't care if you're going into business, into law, into medicine, into health, airplane mechanic, hairdresser. I don't care what the hell you're going to do. You need to understand this because these are going to be your clients. These are going to be your bosses. These are going to be people who can make your professional life a living hell. We should be teaching people how to get into healthy relationships by creating this, by no longer, because right now we're in the age of sort of the narcissist bro. Like, I want to be like him because he's a baller and he's got a yacht, he's got a Lambo. I don't care if he's a dick, like he gets the girls. If that's a trope and that's a viable mentality, and these people are being rewarded with billions of dollars and tons of societal power. I always say to people, listen, somebody has $1 billion, that's their billion. Let them go with God. Just don't marry them. That like if somebody is really successful at what they do, but they're cruel, admire from a distance, but don't get close to them. You might even want to think twice about working with them. And so it's that sense of, it's almost like I don't want to be Napoleon's friend, even if I could go back in time. I'm guessing Napoleon wasn't a good guy. But so we read about him in the books, but it doesn't mean we have to be with them or be like them. But what the pushback I've gotten from young college students for years when I was an academic is, because I taught a lot about narcissism in my classes, was, well, how are we supposed to be successful without being narcissistic? And I think it's absolutely possible. And there's great research on empathic leadership and compassionate leadership, but it's harder because you play by the rules. And if you play by the rules, it's a lot harder to get to be the king of the mountain.
That was
So I think it's educational.
got it.
Chase, I think we have to teach and and not pathologize. That's not what I'm going for, is we have to give people permission to call out bad behavior as bad behavior. Right now, our systems protect narcissistic people more than they protect the people who are harmed by them.
Excellent and very insightful. That was sort of a thread that I wanted to explore. And I think the question that your students asked is a question that was on my, list of things to talk about. And so I'd like to pull on that thread just a bit more. You cited your own experience of being on TV as the wounded 5-year-old. And I think that what is of interest to me is, as someone who provides a platform for other people to speak, who have created innovation, who do stand out from their peers for excellence or achievement or success. I shared with you before we started recording, I'm on deadline on my book right now, and it deals a lot with the ability to, what's the relationship between success and fulfillment, and and I would be lying if I didn't say that I have experienced some of the same things. I like to think of my life in 2 arcs, but that you shared about being a wounded 5-year-old who wanted to be on television. And I'm wondering, so there's twofold to my question. One, is it possible to not just heal, but to transform in a second arc of your life? So that's question one. And then question two, is it possible to be, I guess this is an extension of the question that your students ask you. Is it possible to be successful, fulfilled, and an example without being narcissistic?
Okay. So yeah. So let's talk about the heal and transform in the second arc. 1000% yes. Now, when you say that, I'm assuming you're referring to the person was the wounded child.
Yeah.
And they heal and transform and reach outside of themselves. Absolutely. 1000%.
Okay.
1000%. I work I mean, at this point, through some way, shape, or form, either in group format or in individual format, with thousands of people who survive narcissistic relationships. And while some people are definitely stymied for a lifetime, they're not they're by far the vast minority. The large percentage of people, once they get it, once they're told they can get set free from it, that they don't need to forgive someone who harmed them, when you really take all the existing paradigms and say, no, you don't need to forgive someone who's a serial offender in your life. Hell no. You free them and they can start to individuate and experience themselves as themselves rather than as a vessel that was basically pouring supply into a narcissistic person. Amazing things happen. I have seen survivors go on to write books and make films and to make music and to create art and to get doctorates and to go back to school and to actually wake up in the morning and feel like a functioning person. So absolutely, healing and transformation. We are living, breathing things. Cut off, tree keeps going even if you cut off a branch. Like nature always finds a way to keep healing and living, no matter what the species we are. That's what's remarkable about life. Now, to your point, can you be successful without being narcissistic? Absolutely, yes. But I'm going to say that with an asterisk.
Yep.
It really depends on what that person's definition of success is. If that person's definition of success is grandiose by definition, I'm going to be the person who changes the this and the that, and I'm going to make all this money. All these people are going to admire me. So it's entirely in this sort of grandiose narcissistic supply oriented, look at me, aren't I great model. Then narcissism is going to help you succeed there. Narcissism works really well in a capitalistic economic structure because it's a competitive structure. Mm-hmm. Narcissistic people are built better for competition than people who have less of that quality. But that doesn't mean people cannot be successful. They absolutely can. But I will tell you, you'll see it gets a little bit frayed in the marketing.
Yeah.
Says me. I mean, listen, I'm a lot of things. I'm actually not narcissistic. I'd be the first to own it if I was. I can be abrupt. I'm introverted. I can sometimes be a little like get angry at the world for not supporting me. So there's some of my dark traits. But beyond that, no, I'm very empathic. I'm compassionate. I'll own that. But I'll tell you, I can't market myself. I'm really bad at it. It's not my forte. And I look at other people like, they're really good at this. And so, it's just not, it's not in my DNA, my emotional DNA as much. So is that holding me back from my full success? Absolutely. And the way the world runs, yes, it is.
Yeah.
And I've seen people write and do things that I don't even think that were compelling, and they knocked it out of the park. And when we go and do the deep dive, it's because they marketed the hell out of it. And so marketing is marketing is very easy for narcissistic people. They're very good at it. And since marketing is the core of what can create success for any product writ large,
an attention economy. Yeah.
They're going to do great. So, but I mean, really, it's that idea of what is success until you operationalize what the success word is. Mm-hmm. Then it gets a little bit, tricky. But I have to say that I've seen many incredibly successful people who are not narcissistic. And I think that that's we've all got our thing, but our quirk, our little bit that makes this a little more difficult maybe is not narcissism. Narcissism is a cake and it's made up of a lot of ingredients. An egg is not a cake.
Two things. One, isn't it sort of, it's like a fish trying to understand what water is, it seems like, because it's everywhere. So it's like, it's, this is why this is a challenging topic. And when I was so excited to have you on the show, because it seems like it's everywhere. And I'm paranoid just having this conversation in a great way. Like, wow. I mentioned again, this book, I've been writing and doing a lot of self-reflection. And if this is like a fish, the relationship that a fish has with water, like you're in it, it's very difficult to sort of be aware of it. And then a similar analogy, if I'm a frog being slowly boiled, my goals and ambitions, maybe at some point were honest and holistic and in line with my values. And at some point, the goalposts keep moving because of the water that I'm swimming in. is it fair to say that the water is actually influencing me, the human? Or
Yeah. Mhm.
is it I am this way and boy, we need to do some healing? Because I feel like my personal ambitions, to use me as an example in an attempt to be vulnerable here on the show, I originally wanted to be an artist and just to be able to, make work
Mhm.
that was felt compelling and honest and authentic to me and share it. And boy, if I could have this living, sure, I'm not, I don't not want nice things, but my ambition, had some constraints to it. And I I am aware that that left the building at some point, and my wife, who
Mhm.
is earnest, heartfelt, compassionate, kind, all
Mhm.
of those things that I seek to be, it was only through like her helping me understand that I was the frog being boiled. How do we?
My ambition, like
Yeah.
you felt like your ambition got more and more and more unfettered.
Oh, oh. I mean, dramatically, because as soon as that
Mhm.
you got a spoonful, then then
Yep.
you need a teaspoon, and then you need a tablespoon, and then you need a 5-gallon bucket. And before I knew it,
You,
yes, I'm
but
saying
you need, not yeah, you, not everyone, you
correct.
did. And that's for you to understand what's the why of that.
But I
What what
felt it
what what was
moving.
it filling
I felt it
you? Mhm.
moving. And so is this narcissism that is expanding because it's being rewarded on these platforms, or is this a culture that is sort of pouring narcissism back into individuals?
You got to remember again what like somebody. I'm going to give you an example, and I want to answer your question specifically.
Okay.
I mentor a lot of people who want to enter the media as mental health folks, right? Whatever it might be, whether they want to be in talk shows or whatever the hell they want to do. And something I've heard probably at least a dozen people say to me is like, I want to be Oprah. And that's when I'm like, time out. All right, what is it? What I mean, Oprah's a human being, so you don't want to literally be her. So what is it you want? Okay. And and it was that lack of intention. It was almost like I want to be
Mm,
the last word on.
mm,
I want to be beloved. I mean, when we think about the brand of someone like her, it's beloved. It was, I mean, when it was ahead of its time, but it was created by many people. I mean, it was a construction of very, very smart people who created this at a point in time that was very different than today. But it's what is it? What do you want to be? Tell me. Because for some people, it's like, I think they wanted to be super famous, but in a savior kind of way, which is to me not a healthy want. Pull the strand out. Like, what is that thing? Like they might say, she was helping people. Okay, so now let's work with the helping people part. But for some people, it's like, I wanted to be that kind of like, savior. And that's not a healthy, that to me is that's too ephemeral and it's not it's so, and you're never going to get there, right? You're chasing your tail. So it comes to this piece of, in order to thrive in these spaces of getting a message out on a platform. Now, it used to be that the gatekeepers would stop most people from getting a message out. Usually, you had a handful of networks. They were run by people who wanted only one point of view, and most people weren't getting on there. And then YouTube came along and social media came along, everything changed. So there's so much noise out there right now. It's like a very, very, very busy, crowded town square. So you might just go over to the corner booth of the vegetables you like, and that's all you're hearing, and then that's fine. But to rise above the din, there's a noise in ourselves that has to be created. So you're right. In a way, we're having to pedal faster because of the narcissistic world we're in, which is why more than ever in history, the work that humanistic psychologists and others have written, authentically, who are you? What are your values? What are you about? Who are you? The real who are you, not what's your brand, not what's your narrative, not what your story is. Who are you? And that is a question most people aren't grappling with. I think a lot of people tell me what their brand is,
mhm,
but very few people can tell me who they are.
mm,
And knowing that piece can help be an antidote to this narcissistic kind of world. But it also means that one's voice may not amplify, because for one's voice to amplify the way many people want it to
sure.
in these media spaces, you kind of have to play their ground game. I've gotten so much advice on how to market, in this case, a book. And it's very interesting because some of the advice is pretty similar across people who are giving it, but it's all about amplification and making a lot of noise. And either you can do it or not, but we have personalities, we have natures, and some things work for us and some things don't. but I do think we're all pedaling faster because of what narcissism has done to the world. And I once had a client years and years ago who said to me, wanted to be famous. And this was actually so long ago that even YouTube was in its relative infancy and all that. Wanted to be like a TV star, a movie star. Want to be famous, want to be famous, want to be famous. And was trying to get to the core of the why of the famousness, because this desire caused him nothing but misery. And we finally, it took us a long time to get there, and it was beautiful and eloquent the way this person said it. They said, if I was famous, then I'd never be alone again. And they meant that both in the literal sense of if you're famous and you have this entourage, right? People always want to be with you. You'd never be, you're sitting at your phone on a Saturday night, which I don't think is true. I think there's plenty of famous people who are lonely. And that there would always be this world who knew who you were. So you wouldn't be alone because there were people who are always attuned or attended to what you're about. So that idea that for him, it wasn't about famousness. It was about loneliness.
Mm. The book is It's Not You. We have, I think, done a little bit of work in today's show around identifying these characteristics, both in our culture and potentially in ourselves. I know there's some listeners right now going, man, I got this. The doctor has just shown me a few things about myself. I might need to go do some work. Let's talk about the healing part, because that's also in the subhead, right? Identifying and healing from this. So give us a path to healing. What are some of the things that we ought to be doing?
Remember, there's people who are going to be listening to your show, given who listens and, who really are trying to be great and innovate and all of that, that might be saying, ooh, am I the narcissistic person? Is there anyone who's sitting there saying, am I the narcissistic person? I want you to know that's the best prognostic sign ever, because the vast majority of people who are narcissistic don't have the self-reflective capability to do that. They would either just turn it off or not listen, or
so if you're still listening, you're okay.
You're probably okay. I would say that but you shared a very interesting insight that you felt like your ambition was getting more and more unfettered, and you had a loving, empathic wife, partner, and she said, I love you, like, what's happening? And you were then able to receive that love and not just tell her to shut up, stop, you're getting in the way of my ambition, which is what a narcissistic person would do, but rather you looked to your loving life partner to say, she knows me, let me listen to this. That is not a narcissistic maneuver. So right there, that dyadic interaction you described with her, I'm like, that just sort of like, no. But you can see how a narcissistic person say, you're trying to stop me from growing. You're jealous of me. You want to hold me back. That's what that interaction would look like if your wife was sharing that with a narcissistic partner. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And it makes me feel better about myself.
Yes. Yeah. It's the not. So again, I'm not going to pathologize ambition. I think ambition's a wonderful thing. It really, really is. And what happens is ambition, like everything else, like in life, has to be calibrated. So you're right. Ambition will go, go, go. And then we need the people in our lives to say, hey, how about we just sit down and play some Scrabble, or you want to watch a movie? And because and when we love what we do, I'm a very ambitious person and I get lost in it. And I do need sometimes the people around me who love me say, slow down, sweetie. Like, we want to see you, and not snap at them and not get overly defensive. Narcissistic people will do that. So my book is really about the healing process of people who are in relationships with narcissistic people. And that might be an intimate relationship. And I think in the majority of cases of people who going through this, it is an intimate relationship, but it could be anything. It could be family of origin. It could be friends. It could be workplace. In the audiences that listen to this, I bet more than a few listeners had a business partner who was narcissistic. And I'll tell you, a narcissistic business partner can destroy a person's decades worth of work. If you get into bed with the wrong person on that, it will harm you the way an intimate narcissistic relationship can, especially if it's a two-person operation. And so that the healing process from when you've been in any form of narcissistic relationship, it really starts with radical acceptance. And the key piece of radical acceptance is the narcissistic personality, the behaviors associated with it, the dynamics associated with it do not change. What you see is what you get. This, the way it is, this relationship, this is it. So you're going to make your decisions on the basis of what this is, not on the basis of what it could be, not on the basis of what it will be someday. This is it. It's almost like somebody saying, I built a house in Chicago and I'm hoping it's warm this winter. I'm like, you built a house in Chicago. It's going to be cold in the winter. Radical acceptance. There's no beach bathing suit version of February there. And so it's and it is literally that. So it's that simplistic. That's what you've got here. And yet in its simplicity, it's a very thorny construct, because the things that narcissistic folks do in relationships are hurtful and harmful and destabilizing and upsetting. And just because you radically accept, because most of us can't get out of all of these relationships. They might be parents, they might be siblings, they may be collaborators we have to continue working with, they may be marriages people can't get out of, whatever it is. You can radically accept they're not going to change. You can radically accept what this is. But when they keep saying hurtful things to you, it's still going to hurt. This radical acceptance around that. And once a person radically accepts, they go down a really painful rabbit hole of grief. Mm-hmm. It is because this is grief of the marriage someone hoped they have, the future they hoped they'd have, the parent they hoped their kids would have. They're giving up on all that. It's a loss of innocence. It's recognizing you were never going to have the childhood you wanted, that it left some permanent scars for you, that you were about to lose everything you ever worked on in this business. These are massive losses. But that hope is what often kept people going. It might get better, or maybe it's not that bad. And so the hope and almost the illusion or the not knowing and the lack of education meant that a lot of people were allowed to sort of stay in their happy place, but the happy place was a delusion, and it doesn't work. And so education, radical acceptance, working through the grief, and then becoming more discerning. Because even if you clean up your act and mourn and grieve and go through whatever you go through with your current narcissistic relationships, I will bet anything I've got on you will run into this again in some arena of your life. And you have to be able to be discerning, so this time they don't get as deep.
As you said in the book, a tiger can't change its stripes.
No.
Okay, so there's some hints to healing there, and you go a lot deeper in the book. Again, I'll share the title. It's Not You: Identifying and Healing from Narcissistic People. If we are to chart a course as an individual, you've given us a little bit of a path there with radical acceptance and managing grief. Let's talk culturally. Zoom out one more time here. And, I think the best way to affect change is to affect it in yourself first. But I would like to have us have a lens toward a future. What's possible culturally? Let's just say we can snap our fingers and paint a picture. What would that picture look like?
So again, I'm gonna before I go to the big lens,
Sure.
like, I mean, I would love to talk about a world where teachers are paid as much as CEOs, because if we really looked at cultural value, pediatricians would be the highest paid medical professionals. They're often the lowest paid. So people who actually attend to children's education and safety, and we paid them commensurate with the importance of their work. Imagine that. Now you'd have all these baller second grade teachers like driving the fancy cars and living in the big old houses, as they should.
It's going to be no surprise to you that my wife is a middle school teacher. So
of course she is. And that, talk about God's work. That's got to be the most challenging student group and the most important. Yeah. But here's the thing though. If I had, somebody once asked me, I have one wish in the world, and I think that would change all of this, is protect all children from trauma. It's that simple. If we could protect, listen, I'm not talking that every child has like these perfect kinds of forever attuned parents. Wouldn't that be lovely? Let's just get the trauma off the table. That children are not physically abused, sexually abused, emotionally abused. And when they are, that we have immediate and responsive systems in place to take care of these kids. And because even our child protective services do not understand narcissism, domestic violence services do not understand narcissism, children get harmed and harmed again and are often not believed. And people who are harmed in relationships are often not believed. If there was one thing we could do that could really pull this weed out by the roots, it would be address that. And I can tell you that, frankly, it's impossible. I know it's not going to happen.
Right.
I know it's a naive want, right? But that's really what it
But
is.
this is why
I
this
will
is the
tell you what,
essence of my question. So I really appreciate you
right.
going there. There's the
Mhm.
difference between
Yeah,
actualizing that and understanding what
yeah.
could stop this process.
Correct. So that's that piece. Now, the piece I do, so for example, one thing that's often troubled me is when we talk and there's a lot more open conversation about mental health and addiction now, which I'm very, very grateful for. However, one thing we've never done a good job of talking about is how does the presence of, for example, a personality style like narcissism in a person harm the people around them? We're even a little bit cagey about talking about the negative impacts of mental health disorders on the people around the person, as though it's like, well, that person's suffering. We shouldn't worry about the people around them. I said, the hell you shouldn't. You ever spend time with a family member of an addict? They've been through it. They've been through it hard. And we often do not support them or we write them off as codependents and leave it as that. The same exact thing happened to people who are experiencing narcissistic relationships. I get pushback every damn day about how, like, well, the narcissistic person may have trauma, or the narcissistic person's going through something, or maybe you just, like, it sounds like you're blaming them. I ain't blaming anyone. I am telling people what constitutes acceptable behavior and breaking them out of cycles of justification. Because what we've always done is almost like we've created an entire class of people who are supposed to exist in service to the narcissistic people and just be what they need them to be. And everything will be fine. Just shh, don't bother dad because he's in a bad mood because he came home from work. But that's the world now. And I think that if we have people who are trained to work with clients going through this and never ask irresponsible questions like, why don't you leave? You spend 2 minutes with a person, you understand why they can't leave. Family court is screwed up. Everything is screwed up. And so fix those systems. Address the family court system. Have judges who understand narcissism and the harm this has on children. Teach you have curricula, not just K through 5, we nail it out of the park, K through 6. Kids are sweet at that age. Middle school, actually, where your wife works, that's where the problems begin. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Middle school teachers are actually in probably one of the most influential educational seats, I think, in this country. Those hormones start to rage. The psychosocial stuff starts to show
They
up.
start
The
to be
abuses that might happen to them.
excess devices,
Yep.
all that stuff too.
They can access devices. Peers become more important than parents and adults. It's a huge switchover place. There should be so much more psychological social education happening at that age. We're so obsessed with them learning like algebra 2. I'm like, oh my God, algebra 2. They need to know how to avoid this personality stuff and be better, show up as better, and also have a place to work through some of the invalidation that they may have experienced their entire lives. A lot of these kids are going through it at home and nobody is talking about it because we're so scared of bringing up the stuff that's home. That's their personal business. It's not their personal business. It's all of our business because every time a child is facing down consistent invalidation at home, that affects their personality in a way that's going to turn them to an adult that won't be walking through the world as a fully functioning person. So you better believe it's all of our problems. These are huge, huge cultural lifts. And it's also about addressing things like authoritarianism, like addressing patriarchy. We need more equity and balance. We need less asymmetry. That's where we live right now. Lots of people, I mean, have very little power and very few hold it all, whether it's through money or access to platforms or whatever. We've got a lot of work to do. And again, I'm a big fan of saying tend to your own garden. It's like a twist on Voltaire, basically. Something I wrote about in my first book, second book, and this book as well, which is I am not going to protect all children from trauma. I am not going to overhaul K-12 systems all over the planet. But what I've done is I've developed a training program for therapists, 36 hours with a certification that therapists at least can learn about how to work with clients going through these relationships without blaming them and wondering like, well, was it how you talk to them? I've heard of therapists saying to clients, well, maybe your anxiety is why he's so angry. No, yelling is not okay. We are not holding space for this person's yelling and abusive comments. We've got to give people to identify unacceptable behavior as unacceptable. That's where this starts.
Hold it accountable. Okay, this
Hold them accountable.
last question that I have for today, and I think it's potentially spicy because my understanding, just a little retread, is we talked a little bit about at the individual level, right? The identification at the individual level, the healing, and then we zoomed out. We talked a little bit about as much as we can, and given the constraints of our conversation here, time and whatnot. Then we zoomed out culturally, identifying sort of narcissism and how culturally you just went through a lovely articulation of what needs to happen culturally. We know that's a big bite that we need to take. Statistically, some people who are listening to the show right now are narcissists.
Mm-hmm.
What message do you have for them? And is it
Mm-hmm.
possible to send sort of a message of optimism and healing, or is it just like, F off, stop ruining it for everybody? Like, what's the message to the narcissist?
I would never say F off and stop ruining it for everybody. It's do the work. That's the message. Do the damn work. All the rest of us are. We're crying our souls out in therapist's office every day because of all the invalidation we've experienced. Do the work. Show up into therapy. Be accountable. Take responsibility. Understand what's involved in a human relationship. Get out of your own damn way. But listen, what I'm saying, 90% of people with this personality style will roll their eyes, look at their device. I've experienced contempt in all its forms. I know how they're going to react. But there are people out there, every so often there'll be the narcissistic person who cheated on wives and girlfriends or partners, or, was a jerk at work and took advantage of people and threw people under the bus. And one day they become a dad. And that's the day they're like, okay, am I going to keep being a jerk? A lot of them do. But then there's some who say, okay, something's got to give. Not every narcissistic person hits a rock bottom. Some do, but not everyone does. Sometimes they lose everybody, right? The kids stop speaking to them. The wife leaves. Nobody wants them. If you're a well-resourced narcissistic person, you're always going to be able to find the much younger partner to take up with you when you're a very old person, right? There's always going to be someone working the same hustle you are. But if you're not that person, you will end up dying alone somewhere. And narcissistic people are very reward driven, but not consequence driven. So they're thinking about what's in front of them. It's a tough thing as a public call out, right? I think that it is do the work, but really do the work. Therapy is not meant to be performative. Like, you see people in a city like LA, it's not like the olden days where people would be ashamed to talk about being in therapy, which is a good thing. But a lot of narcissistic folks actually have their whole therapy industrial complex working. They got the therapist, they got the coach, they got the men's group, they got the kale smoothie group, they've got the morning hikes, they got the meditation this, they've got the microdosing that, and the psychedelic, whatever the hell it is that. They got their whole thing going, but they're making absolutely no progress, because ultimately, to address your narcissism is to hold space for your vulnerability, for your shame, to let go of the construct of perfectionism, to accord other people's needs at the same level as yours, to pull yourself out as the sun in the solar system and perhaps make yourself a lesser planet. And that is a huge shift. And what we see with a lot of narcissistic folks is that some of them will make a little bit of progress in therapy. It's usually not enough to save a relationship, but they're very reactive. So when things don't go their way, that the launch doesn't go the way they want, or the money doesn't come in the way they want, or somebody rejects them the way they don't want, they're very reactive and angry. Sorry is not an eraser. This idea that an apology makes it better is BS and narcissistic. Learn to apologize. Like, at least if you're going to apologize, do it right and be accountable. Not, I'm sorry you feel that way. Learn to make amends. Learn to take accountability. Learn that some people don't come around. Learn that you may not always be forgiven because you don't get to be forgiven, especially if you screwed someone twice. It's all of that stuff. But it's about humility. It's about vulnerability. It's about addressing shame. And, if somebody's narcissistic and they say, but, I had a rough childhood, my old man was a tough guy and he threw me around, then get trauma work, because those are old wounds. Get in there, do that trauma work. Like, it's work, and it's humble work. It has to matter to you. For most people, they don't have any skin in the game because they think everything's fine, especially if they're at the top of their game.
so insightful, so helpful. I want to say thank you. It's been an absolute
Thank you,
treat
Chase.
having you on the show. Again, the book for everyone out there, It's Not You, Identifying and Healing from Narcissistic People. Thank you so much for being a guest and for sharing this insight with us. And I think there's a lot of, I think we have some people's attention based on today's show. So thank you for sharing.
I hope so. And again, I believe everyone has the potential to heal if they put in the time, including the narcissistic folks, but the time and the effort,
It's real.
you got to be willing. You got to be willing to, to have the humility to do so. And that's one of the hardest things to do. So thank you again. I wish you all the luck on getting your book done. I'm very happy for you. So it will happen. It will happen.
Yes.
Obviously, it always does. Somehow it always meets the deadline. I'm sure you will. So thank you.
It's true. Thank you so much. And signing off, the doctor and myself, we bid you an amazing day. Thank you very much.